Hey there, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud. This is our Crime Me to Sleep bedtime series, and we've been reading Buried Beneath the Boarding House. This is the second episode, so if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and go into the playlist to start the book from the beginning. Let's get into episode 2 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. Born Alone. Redlands, California was a town well on its way to being a city in 1929. The Dust Bowl days of the Great Depression had driven half the population of the Central States in a great exodus across the California border to the last place where the land was still green. Even little farming communities had gone, from crossroads, general stores amidst the fields to burgeoning townships. The Native American and Mexican populations of Redlands had always been substantial compared to the number of late arrival white settlers. But now they were being drowned out by the itinerant workers who had never moved on. Navel oranges were the crop of choice, with sprawling orchards surrounding the town in every direction, covering 15,000 acres. The local workers, forced from their agricultural roles by the influx of new farmers, found themselves in the fruit packing warehouse, working long, sweltering hours for a fraction of what they used to be able to command for their skilled labor. It was there that you might have expected to find Trudy May and Jesse James Gray, cramming oranges into crates and loading them onto trains. But that young couple had been told to never darken the factory's door again after showing up drunk one time too many. They were both migrants to Redlands, carried along with the tide of job seekers, despite sharing none of their experience with agriculture. They looked around at the dull and weary people around them and assumed that anyone could do the work. As it turned out, they couldn't. After being turned away from the fruit packaging plant, Trudy couldn't find anyone to employ her, so the couple were left exclusively reliant on the pathetic amount that Jesse made picking cotton for a sharecropper out a distance into San Bernardino County. Many days he'd be too drunk to show up to work, so he wouldn't get paid. On the days that he did show up and get paid, he often drank his earnings before he even made it home. In this volatile household, on 9th of January 1929, Dorothea Helen Gray was born. The 6th of 7 children, she was predestined to be the last in line for everything. Despite being well aware of her impending baby, Trudy hadn't slowed her drinking throughout the 9 months of pregnancy, and it was to this that Dorothea's short stature could be ascribed. Even when she was breastfeeding Dorothea, the flow of liquor didn't stop, resulting in the baby spending most of her time in a silent stupor, wallowing in her own filth for hours at a time. For all that her mother's milk was tainted, at least it was consistent. When the time came for the child to move on to solid foods, there was rarely any to be had. Her older siblings taught her how to scavenge for scraps from a very young age, using the hungry toddler as a prop in their attempts to part neighbors from their food. When stories of their begging made their way back to Trudy, she was furious at her children, shaming her by behaving in that manner, and she was swift to apply corporal punishment to mend their ways. The older children were accustomed to their mother's moods and knew that if they got out of reach and waited for her to work her way a little further down the day's bottle, then her fury would soon abate. They were quick on their feet and ready to dart out of the house at a moment's notice. Dorothea, barely able to walk at that age, was not so capable. She received all of the beatings that were intended for her siblings. The vast majority of Trudy's anger was quite rightly directed at her husband, but he was never around to receive it, so that too was passed down to Dorothea. There was no real sadism in her treatment of the children, so much as there was a profound disinterest. Children were an unwanted chore in a life filled with unwanted chores, and while Trudy could muddle through when she had to, her preference was to pretend that the kids didn't exist at all. That way, she could focus on her far more important tasks, like the acquisition and consumption of as much alcohol as possible. Jesse James Gray was a rare sight for his children, a sleeping body or a glowering tempest passing through the house on his way to work or to a bar. The few interactions that he had with them were interspersed with bursts of violence. Trudy may not have cared about the children, but it was from a position of neutrality. Jesse, though, seemed to actively despise the girls, and if they came into reach, he'd slap them just for the sake of doing them harm. He didn't want them around when he was at home, trying to take what little pleasure he could find in his wife, so the children were often banished altogether to the streets at night when he did find his way back home. These evening excursions were rare, but they provided the kids with an extra opportunity to scavenge for food, so they tried not to waste them. The streets of Redlands were different in the dark. The white stonework of the municipal buildings took on a spectral quality by the moonlight, and the good-natured people that the children were likely to encounter through the day were all asleep in their beds. Night was the time of the drunkard and the petty criminal. The dark shapes that they saw roaming the streets could have carried kindness or cruelty within them, of which the Gray kids had no hope of knowing until it was almost too late. They knew from their mother that a drunk could be capable of almost unimaginable acts of benevolence one moment and viciousness the next. Each time they tried for a handout, they knew the risk that they were running, and each time that things went wrong, it was Dorothea who was too slow on her feet to escape. The backhanded slaps intended to drive off the children would knock her into the gutter. The grasping hands that merely brushed her sister's skirts would lock onto her thighs. She was essayed on more than one occasion, but neither she nor her siblings would talk about it. They were all uncomfortably familiar with the mechanics of S, growing up in a single-roomed house with two alcoholics tends to be quite educational in that regard, but they had also been indoctrinated thoroughly by their visits to church each week that S was a wicked sin, and being party to it made her evil. Underlying that instilled guilt was the unavoidable truth that nobody really cared about them. They had been taught time and time again that asking for help was tantamount to asking for trouble. So even when Dorothea suffered the most grotesque indignities, she did so in silence. As unlikely as it seems, things soon took a turn for the worse for Dorothea's family. After passing out drunk in the cotton fields one night, Jessie awoke the next morning, soaked to the bone with a hacking cough. As the month stretched on, the cough got worse and worse, until eventually his sleeve was perpetually stained with the blood that he wiped from his lips. It seemed like pneumonia, so the doctor prescribed him strict bed rest, cutting off the family's only source of income. Despite squandering the pittance of savings that they had left on medication, his condition did not improve. It was only in the final days of his confinement, when the priest and doctor were called around again, that the true diagnosis came to light: tuberculosis, which was lethal and contagious. The whole family had been exposed to the pathogen, and that made them a risk to the whole community. The church was quick to furnish the family with food for the duration of their months of quarantine. Dorothea's first lesson in the benefits of eliciting sympathy. But as time rolled by, without so much as a sputter from any one of the women, the flow of charity slowed to a trickle. Jesse James Gray expired in the early months of 1937 with little fanfare. Dorothea was only 8 years old when he was buried in the potter's field reserved for those too poor to afford a real funeral. But already any sense of sentimentality about the loss of her distant father was overwhelmed by the practicalities of her situation. With Jesse gone, so too had gone the family's only source of income, and while the people of Redlands were kind and sympathetic to the young widow, they weren't stupid enough to employ her. Trudy soon took up with several different boyfriends about town, each of whom provided her with pittance in exchange for her company. The children spent more and more nights alone in the family home, fending for themselves and being considerably better off for their mother's absence. Often, those overnight stays would stretch out into weeks when they didn't see her, which were the nights when Trudy went straight from her appointments with men to the bar, trying to wash away the memories and tastes of what she had just done with rye whiskey. Despite the absence of their mother, the kids muddled on, with the eldest learning the fundamentals of cooking and the youngest using their innocent appearance to beg with more efficiency. They had evening meals with many of the Mexican families in the neighborhood, but always Dorothea tried to pay her way by cleaning dishes and helping out in the kitchen. It was clear to everyone that Trudy was on a crash course with disaster, and before long, this prediction was proven more accurate than many would find palatable. A year after the death of her husband, while riding pillion on the back of a motorcycle with one of her clients, she was involved in a tragic accident. A car clipped the back wheel of the bike, sending it flying off the road and down a rocky slope. Even after it was retrieved, the body couldn't be made to look human again after such violent and repeated impacts. When the police tracked the kids down and informed them of their mother's death, none of them seemed to be terribly surprised. If anything, they seemed relieved that they would no longer have to deal with her visits, interrupting the tentative peaceful existence that they had made for themselves. Sadly, the children had no such luck. The apparatus of the state care system swung into lumbering effect, taking all 7 of them into custody before scattering them to various orphanages that had spare beds. For the first time, Dorothea was completely alone, with none of her siblings for support and guidance. It didn't go well. The orphanages were grotesquely understaffed and underfunded, with a quality of food comparable to when Dorothea had been forced to dig through neighbors' bins for leftovers. By the time that she turned 10 the following year, Dorothea's future started to look less bleak. One of her mother's sisters had finally been informed of Trudy's death, and she was set on adopting all of her nieces and nephews to get them out of care. It took several months to track down each of the kids, and considerably longer for all of the paperwork to be processed, but eventually Dorothea was reunited with the only family members that had ever mattered to her. In Fresno, California, Dorothea had the opportunity to start over, to set aside all the horrors that she had suffered in her first decade of life, and make new memories. Her older sisters, always the source of wisdom in her life, had begun doing exactly that, talking about their parents' death in a traffic accident in vague terms, and glossing over all of the horrific details of their life back in Redlands. They wanted to be normal girls, living normal lives, not victims of terrible circumstance. That was not enough for Dorothea, who had suffered worse than any of them. Even the vague deceptions of her sisters were too close to the painful reality to endure. To truly feel safe in her new life, she had to create more distance from the past. So she set about cobbling together a whole new history for herself out of the only good memories she had. Those nights spent in the homes of Mexican families that seemed to care about her and the loving embrace of her siblings. When asked about her past, she fused and inflated those elements into a new life. She'd grown up in Mexico, in a family of 18 brothers and sisters, happy and loved, before coming to the States to start a new life. She would repeat that lie so many times throughout her life that it completely replaced the truth in her recollections. For a traumatized child, memory was a malleable thing, and that ceaseless repetition soon grew additional details about her home, her beloved sisters, her life. She learned Spanish to support her lie. She tried to blend into the Mexican community in Fresno, desperate to return to those happy memories of a place and time that never existed. Thank you for listening to episode 2 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this true crime story so far, please hit the like button and remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Until then, good night.